He's both a sociologist and a moralist of modernity. And I talk about him in terms of thinking of him as a post-Cartesian sociologist. Someone who would say, not I think, therefore I am, that is to say, not that I'm rational, therefore I exist, but we think, therefore we are social. Right? We think, therefore we are social. And he comes to us in the framework of the emergence of sociology in the 19th century as a discipline underpinned by scientific rationality, an investment in scientific rationality that we talk about as positivism, really, the sense that you can scientifically account for external social facts. And Durkheim really is an inheritor of that positivist tradition that comes through us with earlier folk like Auguste Comte. Durkheim was critical of Comte, and I think he moves away from positivism, but certainly in his earlier work he is really a positivist of a kind. By the time of Elementary Forms, he's talking about the consciousness of consciousness. It's a very kind of post-Cartesian, post-positivist notion, I think. That sense that we have consciousness, but there is outside of us a consciousness of our consciousness. And that is where the social manifests itself. I'll talk about that a little later on. I think there are two questions to ask or to think about when we think about Durkheim. Oh, I should just say one other thing. I'm actually not a great fan of Durkheim, and I know it might be a slightly disillusioning thing to say at the beginning of a talk, but there is a sense that when we talk about key thinkers, we're supposed to put ourselves in some sort of fannish relationship with them and present them sort of uncritically to you. And I'm not a huge fan of Durkheim, and of course he has his critics, and I'll talk about that a little later on too. But I think that Durkheim is really foundational. And in fact I like that word elementary. I think Durkheim is elementary. He's kind of a bit basic in some respects, but elementary. And you've got to read Durkheim in order to move on. You can't move on until you read Durkheim. So I want to make that case for him as foundational and elementary. But one should not be uncritical, of course, in terms of one's relationship to any key thinker. Durkheim, perhaps in particular. Two questions I want to ask through this talk is, first of all, how do we think about the social in the framework of modernity when we know that sociology emerges really as a human science, right? It's got that scientific imperative, emerging to talk about modernity. It's a product of modernity that is also a way of talking about modernity. How do we think about the social in the framework of modernity? And then also, how do we think about modernity in the framework of the social? Right? I think they're the two questions worth asking. Just to think a little bit about Durkheim's context. Durkheim was a provincial-born French Jew growing up in anti-Semitic France. It's worth thinking about that, really, and I'll come back to that as a topic really later on. Living through the Franco-Prussian War, where France found itself defeated, living through the siege of Paris by the Germans, living through the establishment of a conservative government in Versailles, away from Paris, following the siege, living through the Paris Commune massacre of 1871, the massacre of radical communards by the French National Guard, about 20,000 or so, I think, an immense massacre, a massacre on immense proportions, so a radical event brutally suppressed by the French government, by displaced French government. Think about the establishment of the Third Republic. I like to think of the Third Republic as a bit like kind of having Kevin Rudd as a Prime Minister. It's kind of like, it's okay, but it's not quite what you want. And the Third Republic is kind of along those lines. Lasted for a long time, though. Think of the Dreyfus Affair, which I'll also talk about, because Durkheim was involved in the Dreyfus Affair during the late 1890s. And then the First World War, so the point of departure for Durkheim, which I'll talk about too. Durkheim's French Jewish Orthodox background is kind of important. His father was a rabbi and became a grand rabbi. It's worth contrasting, for example, Marx's German Jewish anti-Semitism as a kind of an earlier a response to being kind of hybridly Jewish, a European Jew. Both went on to become secular intellectuals. Kind of worth thinking, in fact, if anyone's coming along to next next week's talk on Gottlob Frege, it's worth thinking about another, in fact, a contemporary of Durkheim's, Gottlob Frege, the German logician, who was rabidly anti-Semitic, actually rabidly anti-Catholic as well, unsurprisingly given that German-French context, historical context. Durkheim wrote about the Paris Commune, and so did Karl Marx, and it's just worth thinking, if we're thinking about the difference between them, and I'll come back to that difference later on. For Marx, the brutal suppression by the National Guard of the communards in Paris in 1871 was amounted to really an unsuccessful realization of a class struggle. He was critical of the communards for not being radical enough. For Durkheim, it was kind of more abstract, and that's one of Durkheim's problems, I think, to abstract. For Durkheim, it indicated a breakdown in the social order. And the sociological project for Durkheim, and this is really crucial, I think, for understanding that combination of sociology and morality for Durkheim, as a moralist and a sociologist, the combination, the project there, the sociological project, is to do with social and national and moral reconstruction, binding all of those things together. I think that's a good way to think about Durkheim. Durkheim marries Julie Dreyfus in 1887. She's a wealthy French Jew, and he lives in what one commentator, one of his biographers, calls genteel poverty. They have two children, Marie and André. Marcel Mauss, who people may know, a famous anthropologist, is Durkheim's nephew. And he writes about Durkheim's wife. She removed Durkheim from all maternal care, all frivolity. Up until the end, she knew how to assure her husband of the most favourable conditions of work. A kind of devoted wife, and research assistant and secretary and so on. And Georges Davy, a student and a kind of protege of Durkheim's, also wrote in a memoir about Durkheim after his death that Julie joyously consecrated her own life to the austere intellectual life of her husband. So I want just to offer the image of Durkheim as an austere sociologist, and of austere sociology in decadent end-of-the-century France, fin de siècle France. And if you think of some of Durkheim's contemporaries here, Rémy de Jumont, for example, but also think of Rimbaud and Paul Verlaine and Maupassant. I think of the production of a decadent, self-indulgent, excessive, morbid, end-of-the-century French culture. And then think of Durkheim as this austere sociologist in the midst of that, and think about how that what that produces. And I want to kind of offer the view that it produces a melancholy sociology. And just think about one of the first great texts of sociology, Durkheim's book on suicide. Right? And what it means for a discipline, the first book that a discipline produces, to be a book about suicide. Right? Think about what that means, and how melancholy is that? How weird is that a discipline that's just emerging, that's coming into life, produces as its first book a book about morbidity, a book about suicide. And I'll talk about suicide shortly. Durkheim studies at the... my French is hopeless, so I'm not really good at translating this, but the Normal Superior School, or some such thing, I don't know, it's got this peculiar sort of French contradiction written into its title. He goes to this very famous school. Henri Bergson, I think, is a year above him, so all sorts of folk are going along to this place. He goes there in 1879, does his PhD. The French PhD is a part of what used to be called the old dispute in France between the ancients and the moderns, the sense that if you were in France, the sort of ancient logic, the old Republic of Letters logic, I'll talk about this a bit later on too if I get a chance, is that you write in Latin, you don't write in French, and the modern response is you write in French. PhDs in those days were in both. You did two dissertations, one in Latin and one in French. The Latin part of Durkheim's PhD was on the 18th century political anthropologist, we might call him Montesquieu. I think of Montesquieu as someone interested in social classification. People take him really as an early sociologist in laws of behaviour, human behaviour, and so on. Very famous for his theory of the separation of powers, that in government legislative, judicial and executive powers should be independent from one another. Durkheim sees this as central to modern democracy, this sense that there has to be a separation of powers, and he rejigs it and distributes it in various ways. For example, in the most abstract sense, the state is and must always be in some way separate from the collectivity, as an other to the people. We often have that sense. Politicians are very good at invoking the people, pretending that they talk about the people. We know that there is, in fact, a massive disjuncture between the people and the state. That sense that the state, in fact, for democracy to flourish for Durkheim, the state has to be disjunctive. It has to be something other to the people. We might think that's a peculiar sort of contradiction, that surely for democracy to flourish, the state has to be properly representative of the people. But for Durkheim, no, it has to be disjunctive. It has to be not representative of the people, not fully, not an embodiment of the people. And that has to happen because it makes people self-conscious and encourages what he calls a critical spirit. If there was no disjuncture between the state and the people, there'd be no critical spirit. There has to be a critical spirit. So for him, that's important to modern democracy. It's part of modernity. There has to be a critical spirit. Right? Earlier, if you go back to Auguste Comte, and the three phases of human evolution for Comte are the theological and the metaphysical and the scientific, the positivist. The early kind of theological sort of moment is a moment where there is no disjuncture between your governors and the governed, between the governors and the governed. There's no disjuncture. Yeah? So, and for Durkheim, this also happens in institutions. In institutions, there has to be a disjuncture between your bosses and you. All right? Your bosses cannot be you. There has to be a disjuncture. And when there's a disjuncture, there's a critical spirit. And that's good for him. Okay? So, the French part of Durkheim's PhD became his first book, The Division of Labour in Society, 1893. A really important book, which I'll talk about a little bit. Division of Labour. And think about this as a sociological text about modernity, advocating the division of labour. This is where he departs from earlier sociology, amongst other things. Division of labour argues that specialisation is central to modernity's survival. It creates new kinds of solidarity. Solidarity is a very Durkheimian word. Two fundamental kinds. The first, organic solidarity. This is produced through the division of labour, which brings otherwise autonomous people together, right? Through the professions, for example. It relies on a combination of difference and convergence. Those two things come together, difference and convergence, to produce what he calls organic solidarity. He sees that as modern. That's modernity. Modernity is about organic solidarities. It's modern and secular, right? We've moved away from that earlier theological phase. Mechanical solidarity is that earlier theological phase, right? That's a kind of religious solidarity. For Durkheim, it's pre-modern, not modern. It's all about resemblance and conformity. Communism for Durkheim was, in that sense, pre-modern, right? It's not about organic solidarity. It's about mechanical solidarity. So it's kind of an important text, this one. It's a reversal of another kind of foundational distinction for sociology, the one that Ferdinand Tönnies, a German sociologist, gave us through a very famous book, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, from 1887, a few years before. A distinction between, and this is a distinction we carry with us routinely through modernity, and we reproduce and re-invoke as a matter of routine, that distinction between community, which for Tönnies is pre-modern. It's where people are bound together primarily emotionally. Community is structured through kinship, through family, first and foremost, through neighbourhood. It's cooperative. I always think of the Lord of the Rings. Remember the Lord of the Rings and the Fellowship of the Ring? Remember? That's a little kind of community, a little sort of bonding, face-to-face bonding between good folk. Very moral too, but also hierarchical, because in the community it's always the father or the priest. Right? It's the top of the hierarchy. Sometimes the mother, kind of criminal communities we might think of, the sort of matriarch in East End London, that kind of thing. So that difference between community and society, Gesellschaft. Society, on the other hand, is for Tönnies, is modern because it's inorganic, right? And it's mechanical, and it's rational, scientific. It's bureaucratic, if we think of the invention of that term, bureaucracy, in the 18th century. Not face-to-face anymore. It's mediated, right? It's structured, it's impersonal, it's competitive, and it's individualized, it's fractured, it's atomized, right? Now, for Durkheim, he kind of reverses that, really. He reverses that distinction and thinks about organic solidarity not as a kind of pre-modern feature, but actually as a feature of modernity. Kind of interesting to think about. Specialization is really important for Durkheim because it intercedes between the two key products of modernity, individuality and the state. Right? For him, that's what modernity produces, and the division of labour is really important because it intercedes between those two things. So here's a quote from Suicide, from his book on suicide. While the state becomes inflated and hypertrophied in order to obtain a firm enough grip upon individuals, and you want to control people, but without succeeding, it never succeeds. The latter, individuals, without mutual relationships, tumble over one another like so many liquid molecules, encountering no central energy to retain, fix, and organise them. A nice little chemical metaphor there. You see that kind of scientific imperative, that positivist imperative in that last account there. So the state and the individual, under this logic, then each exceed each other. Right? Individuals are in excess of the state, and the state is kind of in excess of individuality. But they're each lacking in themselves. Specialization in the professions and so on produces the sociality, what he also calls social solidarity, that neither the state nor individuality can provide. Something has to provide a different kind of sociality for Durkheim, an organic sociality, social solidarity. The problem is, of course, is how much specialization can modernity tolerate? How much specialization can it tolerate? And we know through the Melbourne model here at Melbourne University, not a great deal, actually, is the short answer. Let me just digress for a second, a small digression on the increasing divisions of labour in my discipline, in literary studies or in English. I've just mentioned this before, but those early French disputes between the ancients and the moderns at the end of the 17th century, what used to be called the Old Republic of Letters. I was quoting from a very good book by April Shelford here. The Old Republic of Letters was a small and close-knit cosmopolitan elite with its roots in Renaissance humanism. Right? Think of this as pre-modern. Its citizens were linked by networks of correspondence and shared an erudite, sometimes they were called an erudite Neo-Latin culture. By the 18th century, the Republic had become a vernacular intellectual world. This is its modernity now. That was relatively more public, open, and democratic. So that the playing out of the modernization of literary studies is really in that kind of that split between a pre-modern Old Republic of Letters and a more modern, open, public, democratic, vernacular Republic of Letters. And I just throw in another quote, really, from a lovely little collection of essays by Isaac Disraeli, the father of Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative British Prime Minister. He wrote a terrific kind of collection of essays that got collected under the title Curiosities of Literature. Quite like that title. He's talking about the modern Republic of Letters. And he says, never was a republic greater, better peopled, more free, or more glorious. As someone teaching in an English department, I'm very nostalgic for that kind of that sentiment. We might think of ourselves now in English as never was a republic smaller, less peopled, less free, and less glorious. Anyway, never mind. But so this is his earlier account. They are intimately acquainted with every language. Right? It's not just Latin anymore. It's all sorts of things. That's the division of labour. The dead as well as the living. They are divided into many sects, and they seem to multiply every day. And I ask the same question about modernity as I ask about literary studies here. How much specialization can literary studies tolerate? It's a kind of good question. How many sects can literary studies tolerate? And it's part of that Durkheimian question to do with modernity and the division of labour. Okay. Now, I've mentioned this before. The individual for Durkheim is a condition defined by lack. Kind of worth just thinking for a moment about how you would define yourself as an individual. What's individual about me? The more you think about that, the more, the more existential you become, maybe the more suicidal you become, actually. But the more difficult that is to define. Right? What's unique about you? For Durkheim, it's not a problem. You have to understand that your individuality is a condition defined by lack. It's what you don't have. It lacks the social, and that's the thing. For Durkheim, the social, though, this is part of his moralism, is a regulatory, moderating, and moral force. Too much of the social produces conformity and makes it pre-modern. Eradicates difference. It monopolises the individual. That's the theological pre-modern account of the social. But too little of the social, and think about Durkheim again in decadent end of the century France, too little of the social produces what he called the cult of the individual. Egoism and his word, anomie, a crucial word for sociology, anomie. In the Division of Labour, he says, morality is everything that is the source of solidarity. Right? Morality and the social go together for Durkheim. Everything that forces man to take account of other people, to regulate his actions by something other than the promptings of his own egoism. It's all about regulation, but for Durkheim, not about constraint. And he treads this really fine line between regulation and constraint. Regulation is modern, constraint is pre-modern. The social ideal, he also says at some points, is spontaneous, about spontaneity. And that's kind of interesting for Durkheim to say that, given that he's really also about regulation and moderation. But he allows for some expression of the spontaneous, the free unfolding, he says, of the social force each individual contains within himself. He's a bit kind of Foucauldian there, the sense that a good citizen is someone who's already internalized the social. Right? That's good citizenship. And there's a little bit of Victor Turner there too. If people know Victor Turner, is really kind of important for sort of later hippie sociology, I kind of think of it as. A sense that true community happens like a kind of happening. It's a spontaneous outburst of the social that brings people together. It doesn't last very long either. So social norms are a kind of problem for Durkheim. He talks about regulation and moderation and so on. In an age of excess and the cult of the individual, an age of egoism. And he's interesting for this, I think, and also kind of modern for this. He thinks about social norms and the problem of the abnormal. He thinks about, he has a very good essay called Rules for Distinguishing Between the Normal and the Pathological, where he says, we shall call the normal those social conditions that are the most generally distributed. Kind of sort of utilitarian notion of the normal there. But the question he asks here, I think, is really, is modernity normal or is it pathological? And sociology, of course, as we know, turns routinely to the deviant, what used to be called the deviant. I don't know if we use that word in sociology very much these days. I think there still is a journal of deviant studies. But certainly in the old days, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, sociology was used that term, I have to say, relatively unselfconsciously in my reading of sociology. But so sociology had built its kind of discipline around this notion of deviance and the abnormal, and when it looked for the abnormal, it found it everywhere. Abnormal is everywhere. What happens when the abnormal is everywhere? So sociology, for example, coincides with the rise of criminology, another human science that is all about modernity. They sit really close together, where the pathological slides from the individual, right? That he or she is individually pathological, right? To the social. The kind of criminal defence now is that it's not me, it's my context. My context made me do it. Right? That's social pathology, as it were. And crime for Durkheim anyway was normal. I mean, the criminal act was a normal outcome of modernity. Actually, amongst other things, part of the division of labour. In Suicide, Durkheim says that normality is always has a really nice kind of throwaway line. Normality is always relational to this and that. I really like that line, to this and that. It's kind of nothing in particular. Normality is always relational to nothing in particular. But what is this and that, I guess, is the question. So we can think about modernity through Durkheim as much defined by the production and regulation of abnormality It's about the imposition of social norms, social regulations and so on. And that, I think, produces a nice link between, for example, Durkheim and Foucault, who thinks a lot about the abnormal and the pathological and the deviant. I know John Froh later on will be talking about Foucault in this series.